lamp. And I guess today I'm going to be trying to shake things up a little bit. In the Uranian style, yeah. The folder of notes, the prepared stuff, it's all on the floor. It's kind of out the window for a moment. And I'm going to try and present Uranus on a number of different levels. And most of all, I want to try and inspire us here today to get a sense of the possible with regard to Uranus. And in particular, in our capacity to look at a chart and have a sense that we can discover things in there, whether we know the person or not, whether we've had long with that chart or not, but a sense of possibility that there might be a key. The lamp of that hermit is made of starlight, if you like. And we're going to try and bring it to the chart in a little way. First, I'd just like to tell a little story. Kim has talked about the evolutionary conditions. And she says she normally spends hours doing something that she had to condense. And I'm going to revisit that ground a little bit, just so that we're clear. And I'm also going to talk about Uranus from an evolutionary point of view for those who aren't familiar with that perspective. Very simply put, to entice us on that level, it's easiest to understand Uranus in relationship to Mercury and Jupiter. We've already heard from Kim that Mercury and Jupiter represent left brain and right brain, respectively. You know, Mercury is language skills, the physical, nervous phenomena that's going on right now so I can speak to you. And Jupiter is the field of vision or beliefs that I'm speaking from. Now, Uranus exists a step back again. Inside Mercury, we have short-term memory. The fact this lecture's at a certain time. The fact that our friend's phone number is a certain number. This is all Mercury-type memory. In Uranus, we have far memory contained, far memory. Uranus remembers everything. To give a sense of the scale of that, if we remember Pluto is our bottom line, Pluto and its polarity point are like a stream. They're like the mind stream, or the causal road of the soul's development, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And it manifests these little egos, people called Mark, like puppets. This soul stream, we can sit on our own Pluto and stare towards our polarity point and understand that we're in that stream. And Pluto is the past, the unchanging past of where we have been fixed, where we have developed. And the polarity point is where that stream is heading, where it's heading towards the ocean, if you like. And the moon and the moon's nodes are like the vehicles we travel that river in. These little body personality units, yeah, like one right here in front of you. Uranus remembers that. Uranus is the part of us that remembers that that's the way it is. It could be likened to an enormous multi-dimensional butterfly, if you like. It remembers all the times. It remembers all the little moons. It remembers the time I wasn't just Mark, I was Dennis, I was Clive, I was Jeanette. Yeah? It remembers, and it remembers what went on. So this far memory becomes the source of the various associations we're going to explore with Uranus. And in fact, the journey through the evolutionary condition of the individuating state involves this memory on a number of different levels. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit to begin with. First, I'll tell you a story. When I was about 13 years old, I went to school one day, and in human geography, horrible subject, horrible teacher, ex-army, real fascist, but we did learn that something like 20 or 30 billion pounds would feed the entire world. Now, this struck me as quite important. I walked home one day, I was pondering this, quite, scratching my head, I was watching telly, I was trying to think about it. And then in a discussion on the build-up to the Falklands War in the 80s in Britain, with the delightful Margaret Thatcher in power, it was told to me that Britain had spent something like 20 billion pounds that year on the defence budget reassessment for the following years to prepare for the war. And the similarity of the figures just freaked me out. So one day at a family meal, and we have aunts and uncles down and stuff, I'm sat there having a sip of wine. Not very good with wine. I often blurt things out. I turned to them and I said, hey guys, 20, 30 billion pounds would feed the world. And we're spending that much on war, potentially, over the next couple of years. And my increasingly drunk uncle, on red wine and a nice big fleshy roast, his face contorted like I'd just done the smelliest fart in humanity or something. He was so distressed by this point of view. And I just stared at him. I was shocked. And I had this lecture from him for about 20 minutes on the need to subdue foreign powers, on the need to defend one's borders and boundaries, on the need for economies to prepare for that, the jobs they created, bullshit, 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 bullshit. And I increasingly just went, whoa, I was like fried. I'd had a couple of sips of wine too many. But it hurt me. It was like I encountered his Saturn. My Saturn was outside of me and it was speaking back in. I then went upstairs later that night, quite freaked out, quite upset, and I lay there in bed and I felt incredibly alienated. I felt like I was unique, that no one in my family wore the same clothes, spoke the same language, came from the same place. I felt incredibly alienated and alone. I was huddled up in bed, And about a couple of hours into that experience, I thought to myself, well, Christ, man, what? I didn't quite say that. I'm talking as a near 33-year-old remembering a 13-year-old, but I said, Christ, man, what am I going to do about this situation? Because it's so depressing, and I'm so freaked out and alone and alienated. And I just made this decision in the moment that I would try and make an effort. And if my life existed and one or two people, well, it came down to one person, was affected in a beneficial way from me existing, then it might be worth the fact that there were these heavy, repressive trips coming down on me. That was my nascent vow to myself. In the first stage individuated condition, Saturn represses Uranus. It clamps down on it. It frustrates it. It suppresses it. It will do this on an internal basis, or the person carrying the Uranian energy will be suppressed, persecuted, or judged by the Saturnian force. This can be an internal or an external thing. That's why in the early stages of the individuating soul, there will almost always be a series of lifetimes with a persecutory or judgmental focus. These are the people, to the extent that they've been able to admit to themselves at all that they're different from the consensus, they will have their astrology book under the bed, in a safe. They will only talk to certain people. They will make a conscious effort to connect with other people who will normalize them. The one afternoon a week they read that weird book, they will go back deliberately and forcefully to the rest of their life as soon as they can. This is the first stage individuated. First stage. If this will stay up. Will someone give me a hand? Thank you. Just turn that little hook round, will you? Thanks a lot. First. It's not quite on here. Is it not? Great, thank you. First individuated. Now the transition from this point, I don't know if everyone can see that. I hope they can. It's a real paradox here working with these kind of people. It's like me facing my uncle. Full of red meat, full of red wine, bleary, ruddy-faced as he was. He's a nice man, but he was ugly to me in that moment because of what he was saying. Working with clients like this, and let's face it, if you're at all an astrologer, even looking at people's charts for them, never mind a professional, if you're at all interested in doing anyone else's chart other than your own, the people you work with will be from the first stage individuated to the first stage spiritual. Because no one with consensus will be interested in this kind of approach. And because people in the second stage spiritual will think they don't need to know. Because they have just got it themselves, man. Rarer too are the second stage, but I'll come to that in a moment. But they will come sometimes, but it's rare. Quite a few of these people will be interested. Yeah? They'll be all excited to begin with. And then the problems start. Because to the extent that you attempt to genuinely communicate something of insight and liberating quality to them as people, they may try and repress you and your capacity to reach them. And their own internal lie, their own internal suppression of their own Uranian energy will be turned around and used against you. And they will either freak the fuck out, clamp down, close out, tune you out. Very difficult to work with. The temptation for the higher stage individuated or early stage spiritual astrologer is to want to kind of help them, guide them, think of the possibilities. You could change so easily all of this. If you lay that trip their way, they could just block you like a wall. Sometimes the only way is a trickster medicine. The only way is to go, well, yeah, it is really rubbish, isn't it? It's really tough. It's really shit. Or to honor where they're stuck, not to try and fight it. But they're very tricky. And actually, this movement, because the second stage individuated is pure Uranus in a way. The second stage is maximum individuation, maximum alienation. So Saturn is out here. Saturn is all around the rest of the world. It's nothing to do with me. Yeah? It's the world out there. It's George Bush. It's the politicians. It's late-stage capitalist society. It's the fact that the workers don't have as much rights as the people in power. Saturn is everywhere but there. Everywhere but in here. Here is just vibrating, uranium. And in both these conditions there is an inherent struggle or contrast between Saturn and Uranus in the chart. The two will be fighting each other on some level. And it's important to understand that fight, particularly if we're counseling people. Yeah.
It's interesting in terms of the original myth of Saturn and Uranus.
Yes. The Greek story.
Kind of works just right.
Yes.
Louder.
There's a correspondence with the Greek mythological stories around Saturn and Uranus, which we won't explore fully now, but they're great to look up. Lots of great castrations and some really good dynamics. Okay. So here is a maximum stage of alienation, and Saturn is projected entirely outwards. That's why it's so rare that they would come to an astrologer, because they would have to be accepting you on some kind of authority level to make it worthwhile. I have worked rarely with people like this, mainly in a counseling dynamic, separate from the astrology. Very, very tricky. I've worked with one person for now 60, 70 hours each week. You know what? So nearly 2 years, whatever. And he still comes sometimes, and he just rants for the first 20 minutes. He doesn't even make eye contact of the list of things wrong with the world. And then I go, well, Nick, remember, we've talked many times about the fact that yes, lots is wrong with the world, but some things are wrong in your life too. Would it be interesting to go back to those? Oh, my life too. You know, if you can go there at all, then that's another extension of the rant. Luck. Now this stage can be, this transition from this stage to this stage can follow many different formats. You don't have to be Osama bin Laden or a terrorist or someone trying to annihilate the state. Although that's interesting, isn't it? That we're placing some of the people we fear the most in our world in technically a higher evolutionary state than most of our leaders. Because at least they're kind of going, well, fuck everything, you know, I'm going to do what I do. But you don't have to do that to go through that state. You could be a 75-year-old lady whose husband died 20 years ago, who's just living on her own in the country, who feels completely cut off from everything, who just stays with that process. You could be a young monk in Burma, having been sent to the monastery at 16, missing home, feeling terribly alone, and go through that state. You could be a little boy in Cheshire, in England, where I grew up, having tried to talk to his family about the world being a better place than, could be a better place. You can experience that state in any way. You don't have to necessarily throw bombs against the culture. It doesn't necessarily have to be violent, just because it sometimes is. Now, in the third stage, Uranus begins to be guided by Neptune. There is a subtle pull from Neptune of possibility. My little sort of seed of that as a teenager was, if I could help one person, then it might make it worthwhile. It can take many forms. In fact, I think the third stage individuated state is a very, very complicated stage. We could spend an hour talk on how to navigate that stage of consciousness. It's an enormously developed state. Just because we have spiritual beliefs, some of us in this room, we can be all like kind of, the individuated states, we've mastered them. But we can talk about people like Einstein in that place. And I have respect for Einstein. He had an imagination, he had a mind of some quality. I don't just instantly think I'm superior to that man. Many of us also, in the spiritual condition, working in these fields, counseling, trying to help people, many of our problems in life will stem from this stage. We can actually move on in a stage without having fully completed. There are overhangs. There are issues back here. And that's important to remember when we're looking at charts, and we're looking in particular at trauma signatures. I mean, I've had some wonderful cases with students, and it's very sweet. A lady in the recent class in our school put up her and her husband's chart in a composite seminar. I'd never seen it before, so I asked her to put up the basic details. Up there it goes, first stage spiritual relationship. I say, well, could we explore it as an individuated one, just to see what we could get first to help the other members in the class, and then go to that point? And about 10 minutes into that conversation, it transpired that her husband, for about 15 years, had basically denied her spirituality and gone completely freaked out about it, and left her several times over it. And it's wonderful and sweet that she visualizes the two of them as two souls together, first stage spiritual, devotional. But that wasn't necessarily the way it was panning out in life. And that's often where we go back into these stages. Here, society destroys us. And I'd like to talk briefly here about a notion of time. In this place, time is like a conveyor belt. Time is the 9-to-5 job. The fact that then I have to clean the house, take the kids horse riding or whatever on the weekend. There's never enough of it. I'm going to die, and there never will have been enough time. Time is constricting. And we get to this point, and we have the capacity for magical time. Uranus is a far memory function. It remembers past and future, and therefore it holds innately the capacity for magical time, that there is always enough time. Because time is being centered on a different, it is not just a linear condition, it is not a production line. I don't just do things to accumulate commodity. And at the heart of the hermit is a child. Because in magical time you have the reality of play. Play cannot exist on the production line, when all you want to do is churn out more to get more. Any questions about these conditions? David?
In the third stage, there's the idea of returning from that Uranian isolation back to
Yes.
society.
Yes.
With the gifts you've cultivated and discovered.
Absolutely.
So, how does that play into that third state model? Is it
Okay. It's a great point. And in Joseph Campbell's work, the famous mythical anthropologist who looked at the hero myths of various cultures, someone commentating on it made the very good point. It's very easy for the hero to leave and go out on his journey. It's very easy to drop some acid and have a trip. It's very hard to come back down, integrate it, and make something transformational and useful out of it. And that's why this is such a complex stage. Here we don't believe that part of us is real. We're too scared. God, how liberating, how powerful would it be if I lived like that all the time? Oh God, I can't even admit it to myself. Here we admit it, but we're so shocked by it. Everything else seems something terrible and threatening to it that will destroy it. So the first step is overcoming the fear of that. The fear that culture or society will reappropriate our uniqueness that we've found. It's more complicated in a way. I mean, Jeffrey uses the term individuated condition. It's stolen from Carl Jung, the individuation process, and Carl Jung's writing on that. Jeffrey's very respectful of Carl Jung. In his own life, he had a period of Jungian therapy, I believe, that helped him understand a lot. In Jungian therapy, the individuation journey is broken down into 3 main steps. The encounter with shadow, everything that is repressed inside us, the overhang of Saturn, that which we can't face through fear. The integration or interplay of anima and animus. And then the meeting with the self, the old man, the hermit, or the wise woman. And that's the Neptunian influence again. So within the third stage individuated, there are a number of stages within that. I think along that stage, along with first stage spiritual, can have enormous amounts of time to traverse those stages. It can take a number of different forms because there's so much to accommodate. We need to ask ourselves, as the client we're with, are we ourselves manifesting in our life something that is unique and transformational of the culture that we live in? That's a third stage individuated expression or manifestation of form. We're actually changing. We're creating new laws based on a state of pure existential freedom, Uranus. There is no concession to Saturn. There's no inner voice going, you should, you ought to, you have to. Laws are made based on pure existential joy. I'm alive, I exist. These experiences have happened to me, how can I bring them back in? It's a very powerful place. Without wishing to knock anyone in this room or disrespect anyone that I've met in my life, a number of people consider themselves, particularly some people in the New Age I've found, to be very spiritually conditioned people. And I'm not saying they're not. I think the evolutionary stages are non-hierarchical. We could be in many places at once. But sometimes they could be centering even here. Secretly they preserve that dream. I've met a number of people. I was at a dance, a shamanic dance, where we painted ourselves in mud and danced. And I talked to one of the ladies at the end, and she was saying to me, I said, oh, in response to something she'd said, there's suffering in the world. Neptune, the awareness of suffering, the awareness of the desire to serve. And she said, oh, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Your thoughts create reality. Don't tell me there's suffering in the world. And I was like, whoa. And I said, well, you know, if my loved ones or your loved ones, if someone just came in this room now and gunned them down, I would suffer, and I imagine you would suffer. And I said, that's happening all over this world that we live in today. It's happening still, as we speak, as we do this dance. That is happening to someone, somewhere. And you're telling me there's no suffering. She looked sort of sulky. The next day we did the dance a second time. We were doing our face painting. And me and her had danced. And as she was painting her face, she started sobbing and sobbing silently in the thing. And I was stood by her and I put my hand on her back. It was a personal denial of her suffering. There was a personal fear of a cancer that she'd had, that she thought she was over her feelings about the fact that she might have died, but she wasn't. Truth here becomes a total existential energy. We can't kid ourselves when Uranus is involved. Okay, cool. What I'd like to do as well in this talk is try and encourage a Uranian sense in everyone here. We've learned so much in this conference already. I know I have. I've been making loads of notes, particularly some stuff on the phases. It really set me straight. But I want to encourage the sense, just that glimmer of possibility or light, that you, anyone in this room, if you were interested, could potentially look at a chart and liberate it in your mind's eye. A chart is like a stained glass window or some kind of dodgy sci-fi Stargate kind of thing, yeah? I watched Star Trek just before lunch. 10 minutes of Star Trek was on the telly. And you know that weird entity Q with Picard? There was some anomaly in space-time, man. And there were 3 different Starship Enterprises all going into it, and they were all getting blown up. And Picard was doing it just to save humanity. And at the end, Q says, for a few moments, your mind just let go. And it was in a world where everything was possible. And it came back in, and that's why you were able to pull it off, even though it appeared that everyone was dying. It's a very Uranian thing, to have that moment where it all just... Jeffrey talks about dendrite formation. You know, literally new bits of the brain are created when we have an aha moment. Dendrites, yeah. Weird, like, neural connections. I don't know much about biology. Sounds like a song, doesn't it? Part of this key the hermit has. Now, the hermit, as a figure, is cloaked. I've been working on this image with a friend of mine who works in prisons. He does, like, mythic drama with prisoners. They enact, like, the Grail story and stuff like that in a very hardcore kind of prison. And of course the guards hate this. Yeah? Because the prisoners don't deserve that. Saturn coming down. So he has to really cloak himself just to get to where he works, with a big series of keys for 7 different iron doors. And that's when he has to let his cloak down and produce the lamp. That's the hermit's secret. That's what we could be like with clients potentially when reading their chart. Because we also, as well as listening to a client, we also need to cloak a little from them. Not nasty now, but they come to us because something is going on that is not understood, that is not clear, that is messed up. And it's no good if we just take that on. It's important we stay with whatever clarity we have gained through the objectivity, Uranus, objectivity, through the detached perspective of having read their chart for them. And this can be done without meeting that person. Our lamp, if developed, can be used to open the key of charts, this weird Stargate that is a chart, this map of the past and potentially the future. So I want to give us a few little hints on how we do this. Very simply, for those who are not familiar with Jeffrey's method, Uranus, the 11th house, or Aquarius in a chart, when stressfully aspected, indicates a prior life trauma signature. A prior life trauma signature. And what Kitty, what I will do, what Kitty was talking about when she did her talk, this PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, Jeffrey has the angle that this gets carried from prior lives. And that through the Aquarian archetype, through Uranus, through the 11th house. So when I say this, let me be absolutely clear. Any aspect from Uranus to any other planet that's stressful, any planet in the 11th house making a stressful aspect to another planet, or any planet in Aquarius making a stressful aspect to another planet, are all trauma signatures. I think we might get a sense already that there might be quite a few of them. There certainly are in my chart.
Is a conjunction stressful?
Yes, most of the time.
Oh, the ruler of the 11th house, do we take that into consideration?
I personally would, yes. Now, I'll come back to that rule and try and show it to you more clearly. Always we start with Pluto. Those interested in doing Jeffrey's homework, those that just want to explore this method themselves, spend far longer with Pluto than you'd ever thought you could. Just literally the Pluto placement, house and sign, just blank the rest of the chart. My practical advice for you would be to not put a whole chart up. Start with a blank piece of paper, draw a circle, and simply put the Pluto placement in, house and sign. And spend an hour, 2 hours with it, if you're trying to learn this stuff. And then we move to the South Node and the South Node ruler. Kristen was looking at a chart yesterday in her talk. a man who was an artist, I believe. He had Pluto in the 7th in Leo, I believe. This is from memory, so I might be wrong. And it was balsamic conjunct Venus. So straight away we know there's an issue with relationships, that this issue is incompletion, that it's been going on for a very long time, and there may be some kind of real struggle on an emotional level. This is stuff Kristen took us through. And we looked at the South Node, and it's in Virgo. And as Kristen rightly said, there is some kind of persecutory message from the past around intimacy. That's the nodal axis. And it was square, planets in the 4th or 5th, Mercury in Gemini and Mars in Gemini. And that's the evolutionary axis in a basic format. My suggestion is, if you've been working on, say, a chart like that, and that's just plucked out of the air, I guess, stay with those symbols alone. Stay with the evolutionary axis for as long as you can. Just go for it. You'll find stuff, if you just stay with it, that you never thought possible. But if you get stuck, go to Uranus. Because it's far memory. And the story will always be in the far memory. And in this case, I believe in the 5th house, Uranus was in Cancer in the 5th. Straight away we know in the far memory that there is a core trauma to the emotional body that probably came through childhood. Because Uranus is far memory, probably through many childhoods. Wow, we know that this is a core emotional body trauma as a child. This is so useful. We go back to the evolutionary axis. What might be going on? What's the nature of this persecutory message this person was receiving? Mercury, Mars in Gemini. We have the possibility of an incest story. We have the possibility of someone trying to complete relationship and sexual issues, emotional issues, being born lifetimes ago, connecting with their sibling, and at puberty sexualizing it. We have this possibility opened up because we know of the emotional body trauma in childhood. And we know that through that lens, Mars in Gemini can represent infantilism. Being like a child even though you're a grown-up. Having your sexuality impeded at a childlike level. Why? Because we know there's a story. Because we know probably, likely, possibility that this person was interrupted or judged or persecuted for that expression of his sexuality. And he has remained like a child since.
I think he was a twin and the twin died.
Yeah.
And it could have been the incest story.
Yes.
I asked him if he's an only child, and I asked him if he knew anything about this child, the delivery or anything around it. And he's tried to ask his mom because he doesn't have any feeling about it, he's totally detached. But I had this image come in, it was so strong, and the signature was so strong.
Yes.
This twin piece, and maybe a death
Yes.
in the womb.
Yes.
And
Well, Pluto in Leo, again, the death of a child is a
Yeah.
potential signature, isn't it?
she won't talk about it, she won't give him any information, she completely shuts down. So, I mean,
Interesting.
yeah.
Far memory. We can trust this far memory. That's what I'm going to give you, hopefully, the seed of possibility of today. That you can trust your capacity as an astrologer to access far memory of yourself and of the people that you're allowed, that you're given the privilege of looking at their chart. And it is a privilege that we should respect. I don't think when some people hand it over to me, they understand what might be possible from doing that. A lot of people, we've looked at a lot of charts over the last few days, and a lot of people have had this Uranus in Cancer signature. And a lot of people will have it and have it parallel with the Neptune in Libra square. Yeah? People in this room may have charts. Look at your chart now, exactly. There may be quite a few of you who have Uranus in Cancer and the Neptune in Libra square. Sometimes Saturn's involved too. Saturn crossed through Libra onto that Neptune at some of that point. Again, we know inherently now through our rule, remember, anything stressful aspecting Uranus, an Aquarian planet, or the 11th house, that it is a trauma signature. The far memory can be used to determine the type of trauma signature. Uranus can be a route to the historical period, the prior life information contained within an archetype. In this case, a lot of souls, I'm not saying everyone, But a lot of souls with Neptune in Libra and Uranus in Cancer have experienced the uprooting from a homeland. Usually this is in classical times, Libra archetype, Roman and Greek cultures. Roman and Greek cultures were founded on slavery. They were founded on the taking of North African slaves, of slaves from other parts of Europe. Cancer being in Africa a tribal signature. Lots of people will then be born in this life and have difficulties emotionally in their childhood. Uranus in Cancer. They will feel detached or alienated or have such severe inner child wounding that they won't be able to fully grow up later in life. What happens, it seems, in my experience as a therapist is, in the very early parent-child relationship and the birth process and then the very early parent-child relationship, a transference is formed based on the prior life memories. The prior life memories filter through. We have a memory of being taken forcibly from our culture of origin, potentially enslaved, and then, hundreds of years later, potentially, when mummy leaves the room for too long, the memory returns. And individual parents who may be, just an average kind of fuck-up, averagely neurotic, averagely messed up, yeah? That kind of good enough mess, yeah? May actually imprint much more serious impacts emotionally on their children than they realize. And often then, if there are moon signatures come in or the south node is present with those signatures, often the mother herself shared some of those experiences. You can take Uranus through the signs and find these potentials to find the archetypal story. This is the kind of window I'm trying to get us to open with the key of the Hermit's lamp. A little piece of Uranus in our hand, if you like. It's a schoolboy joke. There's a schoolboy joke there somewhere. There really is. Can turn the wheel of the chart. For example, well, there's all sorts. I'm going to go on to the Virgo stuff tomorrow, so I won't deal with that now. Are there any questions about what I've said? Did people follow the capacity to move back through the archetype? Through the far memory? I mean, in a way, these are my personal senses of what these archetypes are culturally. There is no exact teaching in evolutionary astrology that one archetype is this period or not. What I'm basing it on is an analysis of the precession of the equinoxes back in time, so age of Pisces, before that age of Aries. I'm also basing it on just a felt sense of the period or time. It's obvious to me that tribal Africa corresponds to a kind of Cancer archetype. Interestingly, with this Uranus in Cancer, Jeffrey talks a lot with the Cancer-Capricorn archetype of the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy at about 6,500 BC. And a number of these people will have memories of that transition. Hence, later in classical cultures, they're having the re-experience of a patriarchal distortion, a dysfunctional culture, someone like Rome, that totally repressed the feminine, that totally repressed anyone of a non-Italian kind of race, really, or empowered race. Okay. So yeah, just on that kind of association, just to riff on that very, very briefly. If Uranus is in Leo, there may be all sorts of struggles about a kind of superhuman sense of oneself. Or on the other side, it's as if one's creative center has just been destroyed or ripped or taken away. Second house Uranus can correspond with deeply traumatic survival issues. And survival issues. And relative to the evolutionary conditions we talked about, the persecution that comes as we make those early transitions can correspond to times when actually that level of persecution reached the level of physical, biological threat or destruction. Yeah, there are all sorts of other archetypes. I guess I don't have time to go through them all. That would be wonderful. It would be wonderful to do a workshop, and anyone who wanted to could put their chart up and I could show you how this works. Because believe me, it does. I didn't always believe it to begin with. I met Jeffrey, and it's obvious the man has a developed sense. In fact, why don't I do Jeffrey's chart briefly? So we always go to Pluto, yeah? I'm going to have to be brief with Pluto, but we always go to it. Pluto's in Leo in the 9th. Sagittarian archetype, seeker, experience of natural cultures potentially. We have South Node in Sag in the 2nd with Mars conjunct it. And the reason why I'm using this example, North Node in Gemini with Uranus and Gemini conjunct it. Forgive the brevity of the example. We know that's a trauma signature, the nodal axis, don't we? Because Uranus is opposing Mars. Mars is on the South Node. We know that something has gone on in the past that was violent and disruptive. We know that it contained natural cultures, Sagittarius, diverse cultures, Gemini. Sagittarius particularly tends towards indigenous cultures. Gemini to like Near Eastern, not quite enough time to fill all of that in, but I'll talk about it in a moment. We know Jeffrey's talked about a life where he was riding on a horse back into his native camp, and the US soldiers were killing his family. And he's riding with the rifle, the Indian brave, and he's just shooting at them. Stop that, stop killing them. And they shoot him. And the bullet goes straight through, and he's born in this life with a birthmark where it hit him. And he's born in this life hating his own skin. Not used to being white, not wanting to be the colour of the people that did that. The memory. And Uranus on the North Node in Gemini, and someone of Jeffrey's evolutionary condition, corresponds to the capacity to remember these things consciously. The far memory is on the North Node in Gemini. He can actually access it in a left brain way, Gemini. It comes through in words and pictures that he can communicate. We could have got that. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not the detail that Jeffrey would have put, but we know that something violent and disruptive happened, probably in an indigenous culture. We know it. Sagittarius Pluto, 9th. Sagittarian archetype there. We can take the risk of freeing our own Saturn. Do your Saturn work. Get a chart, prepare it, look up Jeffrey's, Pluto in the house, write some notes, whatever. And then maybe take the courage to step beyond the Saturn level. Take the risk of allowing your own Uranian sense of what's possible to communicate itself to you. That's the only way, in my experience, to learn evolutionary astrology. Pretty much every other kind of astrology can be learned in a relatively purely technical fashion. Are we with that sense of possibility a little bit? Am I getting too serious, or? Sometimes I get kind of serious, I'm a Moon Venus Capricorn. There's a lot of serious as well alongside the humour. What would you like to do? What would you like me to do? What would be most useful for you? Because I've got loads I could do, but we're all limited by time and Saturn, even when we do our best to rebel. Yes.
I was going to just say, mention the difference between the retrograde and the non-retrograde.
Okay, sorry. I'll yell, sorry. The retrograde function I'm being asked about always involves a stepping back. The tendency with Pluto and Uranus retrograde is to form... Well, it's complex. It doesn't always work like this, but as a general rule, there will be a tendency to want to develop those aspects of consciousness outside the cultural norms of society. Uranus retrograde doesn't have to, but can correspond with an increased sensitivity to remembering these things, particularly if it was allied to the evolutionary axis, allied to the Pluto or South North Node, or as a skip step. I mean, right now in life, and I'll come back to the other questions if I can, Neptune is in Aquarius. Uranus is in Pisces. There's a mutual reception. There is a larger collective intention that these prior life woundings be healed. We're combining the Pisces and Aquarius archetype here, and we're combining the Aquarius and Pisces archetype here. There is an intention for the healing of these far memory damages, these long-term stresses and traumas. It's a collective intention, emphasized by Neptune being on its own south node and just having passed it. Every planet has a node, not just the moon. Neptune is on its own south node. It is coming to its own origin point, its own, where it came from. To the extent that we're interested in self-development work, to the extent that we're interested in counseling others, the integration of these prior life traumas is a key aspect of the healing on this earth right now, in my opinion.
I have just a question about how you work with people when you see the trauma and they're stuck in that second stage individually.
My secret with my long-term client in that way has been to play him at his own game. He comes in and rants for 20 minutes, half an hour, how shit everything is, and I just go, yeah, it's shit, isn't it? Because I think it is shit that the world's like that. So I just agree with him. After about 5 minutes of agreeing with him, he gets quite agitated and fed up, and he starts wanting to engage me on another level. And at the moment we've reached this point where he grudgingly respects me. He calls me the old hippie, but he means it as a sign of kind of some, even though he hates all that thing, you know, on some level. He's a radical Marxist, Trotskyist kind of type. We have some great weird conversations. So my view has been a trickster wisdom. If you try and play Saturn, they will just push you away. Somehow you have to ally yourself with the alienated part. You have to get round Saturn. Otherwise you're just doomed. And in a one-off session as an astrologer, that's very, very hard. I mean, I have the advantage of a regular therapeutic context. As a one-off astrologer, that's very hard. And you're going to have to weigh up in each individual time how much to take the risk. Because I've been kicked back. People in first stage individuated it was. All so excited. She stayed at my house for something else because she wanted to go to a Buddhist empowerment that we were all going to. And she wanted an individual reading. And then on the day she showed up with her sister and her sister's daughter. And she just rung me a few hours before they arrived saying, can I bring all these other people too? Because I'm so excited to do your thing. At that time I charged a minimal amount. I was so like in my kind of, I'll serve the world for hardly anything kind of phase. Didn't last too long. She kicked back. We did it, and her sister confessed to me in the first 5 minutes of the reading that she'd never ever been happy. She never ever felt like she'd fully incarnated or belonged on this planet at all from day one. She was in her 50s. It had never ever happened. And I suggested to her counselling, because that sounded so serious, such a kind of, I didn't even go on that much with the reading, other than to talk a little bit about why that might have happened. And of course this fed back. The lady that kicked back at me had a wonderful reading with me. She was off to Nepal. She was going to go to this monastery, this kind of thing. And 3 or 4 days later I got the nastiest letter I've ever received. And I wrote back such a lovely reply. And she went off to Nepal to Kopan Monastery for 6 weeks. And she came back and she wrote me another letter just as nasty. After 6 weeks of compassionate meditation. Wow. People don't change that easily, you know? I binned that one. But my response was just so nice. But it hurt. I redefined my work after that point. It went in. Because I realized that people don't always know what they're getting into.
Was that because of the way you read her sister, or?
She was just so freaked out that someone in her family could be given the opinion by me that they needed counselling. Even though her sister had said, I've never ever been happy, never ever felt wanted or even been here at all. which I took to be truthful and quite upsetting information in a way.
She thought she was bringing them to a party.
Yeah, like a kind of, oh, fun. What's going to happen next? Yes?
Would you share with us, please, Pluto conjunct Uranus generation?
I will be doing that tomorrow.
Oh, you're doing that tomorrow, right?
This talk sort of ties in that I've saved quite a lot of it. Because in that Pluto in Virgo generation, we have the movement from Uranus in Leo, Pluto in Virgo, up to Uranus in Virgo, then the conjunction, and then the Uranus going into Libra and still being conjunct the Pluto in Virgo. So I will try and talk about that transition. Yes. There's a few. Go on.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead. Mine's kind of long.
Okay. Yeah, so someone at the back, just because you've asked one, is that okay? And then I'll come back to you.
You talked about the short-term memory with Mercury and the long-term memory with Uranus. What about a 0-degree conjunction of those two planets?
Okay. Is it balsamic or new phase? If you put...
We want both. Let's talk about both, yeah.
Okay. If it...
What's the question?
Yes. The question is, what happens when Mercury and Uranus are conjunct? There's a couple of possibilities here. It runs the whole scale. At the higher end of the scale, you have the capacity in the left brain to actually access some of that information and to be quite brilliant in terms of your thinking. And you know that image of the multidimensional butterfly I had briefly for Uranus? That capacity to catch the flights of that somewhat. And it can correspond to a deep trauma around the mind, around communication. If it involves the Gemini-Sagittarius axis, it can be about telling the truth. A lot of people have found in certain periods of history that telling the truth is something that has enormously traumatic consequences. So in their far memory, they know that lying, Gemini, is sometimes the best policy because you live longer. It runs a whole range, potentially. If it was balsamic, that's been going on for a long time. It's coming round to be understood. In new phase, the mind will just be incredibly like, bring it on. Talking to everyone, linking it up instinctually. There was someone who tried to ask me a question that I didn't answer. Is it brief? Is it?
Well,
Yes.
I guess it's similar. It's about Uranus-Sun conjunction.
With the Uranus-Sun, we have the whole paradox of the Leo-Aquarius relationship. At the moment, I'm like this individual out here, and you're like the group there, and I'm trying to talk in a way that hopefully brings us together as a group. That's the transition from the Leo to Aquarius. The Sun, we've heard it's the center, that everything revolves around it. Whereas Uranus is the periphery, it's the edges. And emphasized Uranus, a Pluto in the 11th, could be people at the back, or, they found it hard to come through the door at the start to begin with. It's about keeping a certain distance. The Sun and Leo people, everything gets included on a self level. There's an inherent narcissism all the time. In the Uranus level, there's a fundamental detachment from that level of the personality. Also, Uranus-Sun in close contact indicate a trauma signature that is the current life intention to deal with. The Sun is the current life evolutionary energy or intention. With Uranus conjunct it, there is an intention in the current life to integrate the trauma represented by that conjunction. It becomes central to the life's unification.
What about transiting Uranus passing over the Sun?
It's usually a sort of challenge to activate that current life purpose or energy.
Transiting Uranus over the Sun?
Yeah, I was just saying that. Yeah, that's transiting Uranus across the Sun is usually a trigger point to get more fully into the current life evolutionary intention. Yes?
Well, I have Uranus in Scorpio.
Yeah.
3 degrees into their first house conjunct the ascendant. So this is obviously some trauma.
Yes.
Some big time trauma.
Yes. Yes.
And do you have an association with Scorpio and trauma?
Well, Scorpio with the ascendant like that and trauma can indicate a situation where, relative to the trauma, there is a deep resistance to being born at all. And therefore there can be, like, on a moment-by-moment basis, incarnational struggles. Because of course birth is a symbolic blueprint for every new thing we ever initiate in life. And kind of the way it went can show us things about the way we meet every new situation in life. Yeah. Birth can be a blueprint. The actual birth experience in this life can form a blueprint psychologically for how we experience new situations later in life. It's a kind of psychological truth, if you like, just through experience, I guess. Mine started interestingly. My mum was strapped out in an old nurse's home, tied up like that, like crucified, and she had her waters cut by a knife. So I came into this world in a kind of crucifixion kind of way. Yeah. Oh well. Hasn't affected me at all, honest. Shucks. And I think I've got 5 minutes, so I guess I'll continue to take questions if there are them. With an Aquarius south node and a Uranus conjunct the north node, then the current life will see a repeat experiences of prior life events in order to kind of detach from them, in order to go, oh right, this is happening again. In order to give a chance, therefore, through that acknowledgement, a chance to liberate from them.
It's true, I have seen myself in the past.
Yes.
And I see how the real patterns come from. And I think it's either wrong or right.
Yeah. I mean, always, Uranus gives us that first step. The first step of changing these kind of patterns is to understand them. And not just to kind of theoretically understand them, to understand them in a way that actually gives us room energetically. We understand it and we see that it comes to this point. We know it's inside us, but we can hold it here and examine it. That's a Uranian first step with healing. We're not just so totally in it that we can't see our way out. We step back and we hold it there. Although that's not everything. This is the problem. Trauma reintegration is a more complicated process than I would like it to be. It can take a lot of steps. We don't fully have time for that. Yes?
What if someone's Uranus is over ascendant?
I mean, it's like, it'll be unique in every chart, yeah? But it transforms that ascendant somewhat like an Aquarius rising. And there can be a fundamental instinctual detachment. It can also show a trauma around the instinctual or sexual nature on its just impulsive level. There can be a kind of, the impulse tries to kick in, but it's blocked at that process and it sort of freezes instead. Now that reminded me of something. I don't know if any of you are doing the homework. Jeffrey's homework. Fair enough, you're not. Probably best. Okay. Well, it was just that first homework chart. Has all the Aquarius south node in the first like that. But it has the paradox that the Uranus ruling it is not around the ascendant, it's actually in the 7th in Leo. And it's actually the person's sense of what other people have and that he doesn't, or it's actually a profound jealousy and that sees him feel so frozen himself and therefore punish others, particularly women, as a result. So it really depends on an individual chart where... And, okay, yes? I will deal with that tomorrow, more. But just briefly, Uranus transiting through Pisces was the question. Well, that's centrally an echo of this Neptune in Aquarius. The fact that the healing of prior life trauma is the significant Uranian activity for the next however many years. That involves an emotional acceptance of the fact that the trauma existed. And therefore the capacity for forgiveness. There is nothing more powerful than forgiveness in these ways. And forgiveness is a multi-leveled process sometimes when it comes to traumas that have, like an onion, developed layer after layer, lifetime after lifetime. Okay, we're wrapping up quite soon. Just very quickly. Go on.
One thing that I've noticed is that I get a lot of clients where the ruler of the Uranus sign will conjunct one of my planets, especially
Sure.
I was thinking about Uranus in Cancer. I get a lot of people who, because my moon's in Cancer, and it's amazing. I've even had 5 or 6 people all within a few days that would be the exact degree. Have you ever noticed?
No, that's interesting, and I think sometimes it is useful to make just a quick check of the people you're working with, where certain key planets of yours hit them, for the kind of impact you might have on them, and particularly therefore a way round certain defensives that might be up in the room that you're working with them. There's in Barbara Hand Clow's Chiron book, there's a very, very useful remembered from Egypt technique of creating a chart for the moment when they arrive and comparing it to their natal chart for showing the impact you could have as an astrologer. I tried that a couple of times. I haven't done it a lot because of time, but that was very powerful. It's in the later stages of the Chiron book. I can't remember the specific point. That's worth hunting out on that score as well. But yes, one's own Uranus position may be part of what encourages the liberation in the other, particularly if you can help them, facilitate them finding their own Uranus power. We need to call it a wrap. Anyone who didn't get a chance to ask me a question, you can ask me in the break if you want. Okay, thank you very much.